Hey everyone, welcome back. It's time for another deep dive. And let's be real for a second. Chapter 5, Non-Democracies and Democratic Backsliding.
Oh, yeah.
It's a bit of a beast, isn't it? I mean, dense, complex.
Yeah,
But that's why we're here.
absolutely.
This deep dive is like your secret weapon for conquering this chapter.
That's right.
We're going to break down the main ideas,
Yeah.
throw in some real-world examples,
Mm-hmm.
and hopefully have some aha moments along the way.
That's what we're aiming for. What I think is so interesting is how this chapter, it takes us beyond those democracies that we kind of take for granted, right? It's a journey into systems where the rules of the game are totally different.
Exactly. It's like we're stepping into a world where speaking your mind could actually be dangerous,
Yeah.
where elections are basically a sham and power is held by just a select few,
Right. Or even just one person.
or even just one person.
Mhm.
So, before we get too far, what actually makes a system non-democratic? What are we even talking about here?
Well, it really comes down to three key things. Okay.
A lack of accountability, limited competition for power, and restrictions on individual freedom. Think of it as the opposite of those democratic ideals that we hold dear, like free and fair elections, independent media, checks and balances. These are the things that non-democracies often just don't have.
So it's like democracy but flipped on its head,
Precisely.
where power is concentrated instead of being spread out.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the textbook highlights some pretty striking examples,
Yeah.
Saudi Arabia, for instance, the royal family has all the power, and citizens have very little say. There are no real elections, no opposition voices, and the media is very tightly controlled.
It's a whole different world. It's so different from those like debates and rallies that we see in democratic systems, right?
It is.
And then there's Mexico under the PRI party. They held power for decades, even though there were like technically other parties. I always found that kind of strange. Well, that's a classic example of what some call a perfect dictatorship. But it wasn't just about, brute force. The PRI, they were smart. They built this huge patronage network. They were basically trading favors and resources for loyalty, right?
Right.
They had control of key institutions, the media, even using social programs like Pronasol to create this sense of dependency among the people.
So they made it so that going against the PRI was not only hard, but could actually cost you, like essential services. You were better off just going along with it.
You got it. It's a reminder that power isn't just about force. It's also about working the system to your advantage.
Right.
And that leads us to the big question. How do these non-democratic regimes stay in power, sometimes for decades? What are they doing to keep that grip on things?
Yeah, because it can't just be about fear and repression all the time, can it?
No, you're right.
There's got to be more to it. I mean,
Sure.
people aren't robots.
You're absolutely right. It's not just about the stick. It's also about the carrot. Non-democratic leaders have a whole set of strategies. It's a mix of incentives, co-optation, and, sometimes brute force.
Okay, so let's unpack that toolkit a little bit.
Mhm.
What kind of carrots are we talking about?
Well, one common tactic is to create institutions that look democratic, on the surface,
Yeah.
but they don't have any real power. Think of North Korea's Supreme People's Assembly. It exists, they even have elections, but it's all just for show, really. They just rubber stamp the supreme leader's decisions.
So it's like creating a fake democracy.
Yeah.
It gives people the illusion of participating without actually giving them any real power.
Exactly. It's a way of managing dissent, making people feel like they have a voice, even if that voice is ultimately ignored.
It's almost brilliant in a kind of messed up way.
It is. It is.
And what about the sticks? Are those the less subtle methods?
Yeah, unfortunately they are. The sticks represent the repressive measures regimes use to silence opposition. And these can range from like super sophisticated surveillance systems to brutal crackdowns by security forces.
It's scary to think about. The book talks about China's Sharp Eyes program. They're using facial recognition and cameras everywhere to keep an eye on people.
Yeah.
It's kind of creepy.
It is a chilling example of how technology can be used for social control. Imagine living in a place where your every move is watched, where even whispering something against the government could get you in trouble. That's the reality for a lot of people under these regimes.
And then there are those paramilitaries and death squads, like the ones in Indonesia during the Cold War.
Right.
Brutal.
These are the most extreme forms of state repression, often operating outside the law and targeting anyone seen as a threat.
It's heavy stuff.
Yeah.
But you mentioned propaganda as a tool of control. How does that fit in?
Propaganda is all about controlling the narrative, controlling the information people get. And in the end, it's about controlling how they think. It's about creating an environment where questioning the regime is dangerous.
So it's not just about silencing people. It's about shaping how they see the world.
You got it. And it can be incredibly effective. Think about the personality cults built around leaders, like Stalin or Mao Zedong. Through propaganda, they were portrayed as almost godlike figures, infallible and worthy of total devotion.
It's like manufacturing consent on a huge scale. They controlled the media, education, even the arts. They created entire generations who just accepted their version of reality.
That's exactly why a free and independent media is so important for a democracy.
Absolutely.
It's about having access to different perspectives, to information that challenges the official story. It allows people to form their own opinions.
Okay, so we've got a basic idea of what makes a system non-democratic and some of the tools they use to stay in power.
Yeah.
But I feel like we're just scratching the surface. I mean, not all non-democracies are the same.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. There's a whole spectrum of non-democratic regimes out there.
Right.
Each with its own unique characteristics and methods of control. And understanding those nuances is key to understanding global politics.
So how do we even begin to understand this, like, massive and confusing world of non-democracies? Where do we even start?
Well, political scientists have come up with these things called typologies, basically categories. They help us group these regimes based on their leadership, where the legitimacy comes from, and how they use their power.
Okay.
It's like creating a map of the non-democratic world.
So it's a way of bringing some order to the chaos. I like it. What are some of the main types?
We can break them down into 5 main categories: theocracies, personalist rule and monarchies, single-party rule and oligarchies, military rule, and then illiberal or hybrid regimes.
Okay, wow, that's a lot. Let's take it one step at a time. Starting with theocracies, those are the ones where religion is in charge, right?
Exactly. In theocracies, religious texts and doctrines dictate political power. A good example is Iran, where the supreme leader, a religious figure, holds ultimate authority, and Islamic law heavily influences the legal system and everyday life.
So it's like God is calling the shots, and religious leaders are the interpreters?
Yeah, you could put it that way. And because their legitimacy comes from a divine source, it's really hard to challenge their authority.
And what about those who don't follow the main religion? Do they have any rights?
That's a good point. Religious minorities often face discrimination and persecution in theocracies, and there's very little separation between religious and political authority.
Got it. What about personalist rule and monarchies? Those seem pretty straightforward, right?
Yeah, they can be. But there are some interesting differences. Personalist regimes often revolve around a single charismatic leader who might claim legitimacy from their personality, ideology, or even divine right.
Like Idi Amin in Uganda, right? He was a larger-than-life figure who ruled through fear.
Exactly. Or someone like Muammar Gaddafi in Libya, who created his own unique political philosophy. Then you have monarchies. They can range from absolute monarchies, where the king or queen has all the power, like in Saudi Arabia, to constitutional monarchies, where their power is limited by a constitution and a parliament.
Right. So like in a constitutional monarchy, the monarch might be more of a symbol, like in the UK.
Yeah, exactly.
Where the real power is with the elected officials.
Precisely. And then you have family dynasties like the al-Assad family in Syria, where power is passed down through generations. It kind of blurs the lines between personalist rule and traditional monarchy.
Okay, so we've got theocracies, personalist rule, monarchies. What about those other two? Single-party rule and oligarchies. I'm guessing those are where power is in the hands of a few.
You got it. Single-party rule is just like it sounds. One party runs the show, and there's no real competition. Think of China under the Communist Party. They've been in power for over 70 years.
They've definitely figured out how to stay in charge.
They have. The party controls everything. The government, society, dissent's not allowed. And then you have oligarchies, where a small group of elites, usually wealthy individuals, control the resources and political institutions. They might not have official positions, but they're the ones pulling the strings.
Is Russia an oligarchy then? With all those powerful business people?
Some argue that it is, given the influence of those figures, but it's not a pure oligarchy. It's more of a hybrid system, which we'll get to later.
Okay, so all these systems sound different. But they all have that same concentration of power, right?
Yes.
It's the opposite of what we expect in a democracy.
Exactly. And that's what sets them apart from democracies, where power is more spread out and accountable to the people. But as we'll see, even democracies aren't immune to the allure of concentrated power. That's where the whole idea of democratic backsliding comes in.
Right. So what about those hybrid regimes? What makes them so tricky?
Hybrid regimes are fascinating because they blur the lines between democracy and non-democracy. They often have some of the features of a democracy, like elections and a parliament, but those institutions were often manipulated or weakened.
So they want to look democratic to the outside world, but still control things behind the scenes.
Perfect analogy, and this makes them really hard to categorize. Think about Russia under Putin. They have elections, but the opposition is suppressed and the media is tightly controlled.
Or countries like Venezuela or Turkey,
Yeah.
where we've seen a gradual erosion of democracy over time. It's like democracy is slowly fading away.
Exactly. And these are all examples of how slippery and unpredictable hybrid regimes can be. They can move towards more democracy, but they can also slide further into authoritarianism, depending on the circumstances.
Okay, so we've got a good grasp of the different types of non-democracies. But what about democratic backsliding? Where does that fit in? We've talked about these non-democratic systems, but what happens when a democracy starts heading in the wrong direction?
That's a critical question, and it's something we're seeing more and more these days. Democratic backsliding is the process where democracies erode and decline, moving towards more authoritarian forms of government. It's like democracy in reverse. Those freedoms and institutions we take for granted start to weaken and disappear.
So it's not always a sudden overthrow. It can be a much slower process.
Precisely. It's something we've seen throughout history, even in countries with long democratic traditions. No democracy is immune to backsliding.
That's a scary thought. So what causes this backsliding? Why do some democracies start to decline?
There are many factors, but we can group them into three main categories: institutional factors, cultural factors, and international factors. Think of it as a perfect storm that can weaken a democracy.
Okay.
And we'll delve into each of those categories right after this.
Welcome back to our deep dive. We're exploring the world of non-democracies and that unsettling trend of democratic backsliding. Before the break, we were talking about what makes a democracy vulnerable to decline. Right, we were talking about those three big factors, right? Institutional, cultural, and international. I'm really curious about those institutional factors.
Yeah.
Are we talking about things like the structure of the government or how strong the institutions are?
Exactly. The design of a political system can actually make it either resilient to backsliding or more vulnerable. For example, presidential systems, where a lot of power is in the hands of one person, they can be more prone to backsliding
Oh, okay.
than parliamentary systems, where power is shared more.
I can see how that could be a problem.
Yeah.
You have a president, let's say they're popular, they're charismatic, maybe even a little power hungry,
Right?
and they've got a weak opposition,
Yeah.
a legislature that basically just does what they say.
Yeah.
That sounds like a recipe for trouble.
It can be, for sure, especially if those accountability mechanisms are weak, things like an independent judiciary or anti-corruption bodies. Those things are supposed to keep power in check. Without them, it's much easier for a leader to abuse their power and just erode those democratic norms. It's like building a house without any support beams. Eventually, the whole thing could just collapse.
Right.
Yeah.
And the textbook mentions the danger of a politicized military. It seems like common sense that the military should be under civilian control in a democracy.
Right.
But that's not always the case, is it?
No, unfortunately not. When the military sees itself as the ultimate power or when it interferes in politics, that really undermines civilian control.
Right.
And it can lead to a very unstable situation. It can open the door for military coups or a gradual erosion of those democratic institutions.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that a healthy democracy, it needs a delicate balance of power. But it's not just about the institutions themselves, right?
Oh.
You mentioned cultural factors. What does that mean?
Yeah, cultural factors, those are about the values and the beliefs that support a democratic system. Things like tolerance, respect for the rule of law, commitment to getting involved, civic engagement, and believing that democracy matters. Those are the things that help keep a democracy going over time.
So if a country has that strong democratic culture, the people are more likely to push back if they see their rights under threat. They're more likely to vote, to hold their leaders accountable.
Exactly, exactly. But if those values are weak, or if there's a lot of intolerance, or people just don't care, or they don't trust democratic institutions,
Yeah.
well, then it's easier for leaders to exploit those divisions and undermine those democratic processes.
It's like the difference between a society that values conversation and compromise
Right.
versus one that's more likely to fall into conflict.
That's a great way to put it. And unfortunately, that's what we've seen in several countries recently.
Yeah.
A lot of political polarization, less civic engagement. It creates fertile ground for democratic backsliding.
It just shows that democracy isn't just about having the right institutions in place. It's also about having the right cultural foundation to support those institutions
Right.
and citizens who are willing to defend them.
Absolutely. And then there's that international aspect to backsliding.
Right.
The global context, it can either help or hinder a country's democracy.
So being around other democracies can be a good thing.
Yes, being surrounded by other democracies can create a positive feedback loop where countries support each other's democratic norms and institutions, like the European Union and its members. They have to meet certain democratic standards to even join.
Right.
But if a country is surrounded by non-democracies, or they're under pressure or interference from those regimes,
Yeah.
that can have the opposite effect. It makes backsliding more likely. And then, of course, there's foreign interference, which has gotten a lot more sophisticated.
Right. That's a big concern these days.
It is.
We see concerns about Russia meddling in other countries' elections,
Yeah.
China using its money to silence critics.
Yeah.
It's almost like a new kind of colonialism where powerful countries try to control weaker ones.
It's a worrying trend. These sharp power tactics, as they're often called, aim to weaken democratic institutions and create division.
Wow.
It makes societies more vulnerable to backsliding. It's like a virus attacking a democracy's immune system.
So it's not just about what's happening inside a country.
No.
It's also about those outside pressures and influences that can chip away at democracy.
Exactly. It's a constant battle to maintain those freedoms.
Okay, so we've talked about the factors that contribute to democratic backsliding. But what does it actually look like in practice? What are some signs that a democracy might be going in the wrong direction?
Well, there are a number of warning signs. One of the most obvious is attacks on the free press. When leaders demonize the media, accuse them of spreading fake news, or try to limit their reporting, that's a red flag.
We've seen that happening a lot recently, where journalists are harassed or imprisoned for doing their jobs.
Exactly. And it's not always direct attacks. It can be more subtle, like trying to control the narrative by flooding the media with propaganda and misinformation.
Right.
Yeah.
Or using money or regulations to silence critical voices.
Exactly.
Push certain outlets that are friendly to the regime.
Precisely. Another sign is the weakening of checks and balances. This can take different forms, like packing the courts with loyalists, undermining election commissions, or limiting the power of the legislature.
So it's like trying to control all the levers of power so no one can challenge you.
Right. And then there's the erosion of the rule of law. This is a more gradual process, but it's incredibly damaging. It involves things like selective enforcement of the law,
Oh, okay.
where the rules apply differently depending on who you are, or the increasing use of executive power to bypass the normal process.
So it's not just about having laws, it's about making sure they're applied fairly to everyone.
Exactly. When the rule of law erodes, it creates uncertainty and fear.
Right.
People lose trust in the justice system.
Right.
And they're less likely to speak out against injustice.
Right.
That's what those in power want.
This is pretty alarming. It seems like democracy can be chipped away at pretty easily.
You're right. It is fragile. It requires constant vigilance from citizens to protect it.
Right.
But that's also what makes it so precious. Democracy is not a spectator sport. It's something we have to actively participate in and protect.
Okay, so we've talked about the warning signs. But what can we actually do to prevent it? What can we do to strengthen democratic institutions and those values?
That's the million-dollar question. There's no easy answer. But I think a few things can make a difference. Education is crucial. People need to really understand how democracy works, why it's important, and what those warning signs are.
So it's more than just knowing the definition.
Yes.
It's about understanding how it functions in the real world.
Exactly. It's about developing critical thinking skills, being able to evaluate information, see through propaganda, and recognize when someone's trying to manipulate you.